This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Democracy, one of several oft-tossed-about words, has lost not only its meaning, but its significance. When you think of democracy, you think of the West. You think of self-determination and individual expression. Recognition of our basic and autonomous human rights are presumed, and their borders enforced by the frameworks in place. In this democracy, we presume there's reasonable opportunity for our interests to receive official representation, and that we might elect leaders to forward our cause, or at least have a fair go of trying. And the fact that we can vote him out if goods are not provided is what makes the process of democracy a living reality. It's the structure of law and order and justice that provides the safety to live and let live, in an implicit understanding where I do my thing and you do yours, as long as there's informed consent and no one is hurt in the process. It's the principle of a civilization learning to work increasingly in tandem and not in the push and pull and grab it's been for most of history. It's the freedom to call aloud in the town square, as we do now, that something is rotten in Denmark, and our countries do not look, do not sound, and do not behave like they once did. The leadership of the West has committed itself more to its ideology than the results of them. They have authorized fantasy to take the stage alongside reality, and its results are the erosion of people's beliefs in our institutional frameworks. But not only, people are losing grip with observable reality itself. They do not trust their eyes or ears, and they don't trust the testimony of yours either. All has become an object of suspicion. The results are a great many people without guidance or direction, and they've become vulnerable to the increasingly extreme and aggressive purveyors of his version of truth, or to any one or idea that promises to lead them to coherence. We are witnessing the abandonment of history and tradition, and with it comes an extraordinary cost that we will not be able to pay in full. Not everything can be replaced. The freedoms which grew from the principles we founded democratic nations on, those which we've so thoroughly enjoyed, were not awarded, but earned through vigilance and struggle to maintain them. While this Western generation has known only peace and easy access to abundance and choice, that has been in fact the anomaly and not the norm, as most of history has been filled with war and turmoil. However absurd it is that we've not figured out a better way, the past 200 years have been filled with hundreds of wars that have killed millions. We really are right now sobering to the reality of the change and challenge that's reached our Western shores, and the realization that we've lost many of the skills and much of the resilience to see substantial challenges through. Democracy promised to change the endless cycle of chaos and death, and it did. Unprecedented abundance brought us to this time and place where we've forgotten what was the point of the endeavor. It was a mistake to sell a brochure version of democracy, which presented the worst crimes of humanity as a thing of the past, and not a measure to constantly guide ourselves by. Wicked, mad leaders were a tale in textbooks of old, and our lack of engagement with this system led us to imagine it as an immutable pillar and misunderstand its inherent fragility. We see the borders of law and order eroding in real time and realize somewhat belatedly what we will miss when they are gone. It's true, democracies are inherently flawed and lend themselves to corruption and imbalances of wealth and power, tyranny of the majority, and were always meant to be criticized and shaped to the public's needs. Democracy regularly fails to live up to the expectations or values placed on it, and so many of our politicians have been captured by big corporate interests and offer favorable legislation for power, position, and pocket change. They have, by death of 1,000 cuts, compromised the integrity of our collective mission as their small sins eroded the path to larger ones. Democracy was intended to undergo fine-tuning to match the dynamics of the day, and you know what? It would still then not be a perfect model, but it would remain the most viable using reason, basic morals, and logic. More to the point, is its alternative is desired only by those who would define it. Winston Churchill said in November 11, 1947, I'll quote, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. It's no mere kids today complaint that an entire generation is learning perverted versions of history in 30-second sound bites grandfathered back to the bias that produced it. Theories are weaved about world events without their individual components understood. We cannot arrive at accurate conclusions if we do not have a rudimentary knowledge of what that people, entity, or ideology represents as told in their own words, and not of what's been said of them by another whose interpretation carries their impression upon it. It's our ability to criticize our governments, the assumption that we deserve better and can and must demand it, that has been the fabric of every act towards change. And its arguments, the tools gifted us to preserve democracy's viability. According to Harry Rubenstein, chair and curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, the birth of democracy in the United States didn't come in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, nor when the Constitution was ratified 2 years later. Rubenstein argues that the first real test and proving of American democracy came with a farewell address by George Washington. It was this peaceful transfer of power that centered the country and rooted its democratic instinct. George Washington's act of stepping down from power was an action of towering significance. And the content of his farewell address was published in newspapers across the country, which helped those values take root. This peaceful transfer of power maintains critical importance for the country and, despite the fight of increasingly bitter presidential campaigns, has retained its integrity. A recent poll found that 52% of young people in the U.S. believe that the country's democracy is either in trouble or a failed democracy. Just 7% said the democracy in the U.S. is healthy. The poll also found that nearly half of young Republicans say there's a 50% chance or better that they'll see a second civil war in their lifetime. We bring this discussion to the table because it is the roots of our values that are being attacked, and our functioning societies deteriorating at an exponential rate. We return to their original definition and purpose before our shared and objective reality is well and truly lost. The future is being determined right at this moment. Its results will shape our world for the foreseeable future to come. As it turns out, this year, 2024, is being called the election year. More people than ever before in history will vote in elections in at least 64 countries across the world, including in the European Union. In total, it's estimated that 49% of the world's citizens are to hold national elections. Just a few of those include critical players on the world stage, such as the US, UK, Canada, Iran, Russia, and the world's largest democracy, in India. And we are now in the tumultuous preening and posing process to sway the outcome. There's been much talk of the corruption and rigged game made of our electoral systems, which has brought alarming calls for concern. Perhaps we've all become sharpened and jaded in our collective and personal losses of naivety in recent years, but I believe we can still make a difference. For if not we, then who? According to surveys worldwide, democracy is in retreat. Over the last decade, freedom in the world is declining, and authoritarian regimes are spreading and getting more authoritarian. The great dialectic debate between left and right has become criminally dumbed down and abandons intellect and process of analysis for solitary trenches and primary colors. This is the pivotal moment that will determine the future of our civilization. Whether these infrastructures are to be pruned and peeled and prosper, or God forbid, to fade for many dark years under the lock and key of technologies used against us instead. The concept of democracy comes from the ancient Greek words demos, meaning people, and kratos, rule, demokratia. The idea being that the government or state power is vested in the people. This was totally radical once upon a time, where rulers had the status of gods and worship was enforced under an absolute rule, where status delineations could not be overcome with a feel-good story of self-determination. Under a basic definition of democracy, rulers are voted in through competitive elections. However, it's come to represent well beyond the choosing of our leaders through fair and free elections. Democracy is the umbrella representative of freedoms of speech and opinion, of movement, of religion, of association. of a country where the individual holds an inherent value and whose fundamental human rights are preserved as principle. In order to maintain these freedoms, there is a system of checks and balances in place which limits the range of the government to wield power. Its structure is composed of several branches of the same root and a separation of powers spread equally to check and balance output. In the U.S., limiting a president to 2 terms only has become indispensable to maintaining that freedom. In the role of the most powerful person on the planet, the scope for corruption and unending rule is felled in one cut by limiting the time a president can serve before he even begins. The president knows from the outset his time is limited, and quest for power cannot exceed 8 years. The 2024 V-Dem Institute Democracy Report assessed that the world is divided between 91 democracies and 88 autocracies. An autocracy is a government in which power is held or concentrated in a single person, aka the autocrat. In opposition to democracy, the autocrat is free from checks and balances and operates above the law. Both dictatorships and monarchies are a type of autocracy, and some autocratic regimes may also hold elections, as do Russia and Iran. Some 71% of the world's population, that's 5.7 billion people, live right now in an autocratic regime. And that's almost a 50% increase from 10 years ago. Let that trajectory sink in deep. The remaining 2.3 billion people, 29% of the world's population, live in liberal and electoral democracies. Our self-assured, unfettered access to human rights and decencies turns out to be a precious and fading opportunity. China, Russia, and Iran, 3 of the largest and most powerful nations on earth, are run under an unflinching and conquering autocracy. And they work actively to undermine our own democracy. As we ought well understand, the war for freedom and power is fought on many fronts, and only a fraction of them with artillery. The subversion of a nation, of convincing it to turn on its own structural values, taught to hate and reject all that it is, all that it's done, and all it represents, is a war fought in the minds of the people for many decades. It is our minds that are the primary battlefield of the day, and the algorithms that shamelessly mold to the individual's weaknesses and desires, its weapon. Apps that make a deafening noise to rile you up and drain your energy and goodwill in meaningless and atrociously ugly fights, distracting you from the point, from the big picture, and the flesh and blood human behind the screen. The use of media as subversion is hardly new, but its tools of today work with breathtaking efficiency. No less has captured academia's role, which we will discuss in an upcoming program, lent authority and scholarly stamp to the crumbling of our traditional frameworks, and is as responsible for its deterioration, as has the cynical corruption of big pharma and science degraded our physical health and confidence in our institutions. The Middle East and North Africa is classified as the most autocratic region in the world, with 98% of its population residing under authoritarian regimes. 45% lived in closed autocracies where citizens cannot choose their own government or head of state, like in Iran, Libya, and Saudi Arabia, while 55% live in electoral autocracies, a hybrid regime with democratic institutions that have been subjected to an authoritarian leader, such as in Turkey and Iraq. And that remaining 2% live in Israel, which has a long-time status as a liberal democracy. It may come as a surprise, but Israel comes out with flying colors in this discussion of democracy. For one, 2 communities who hold fundamental opposition to the state of Israel itself sit inside and are represented in its Knesset. Israel had universal suffrage since its modern inception as a recognized state in 1948. Universal means everyone. Women, Arab citizens, and the ultra-Orthodox who do not fulfill the country's mandatory army service, making it one of the oldest continuous democracies where everyone has the right to vote. The Israeli parliament is called the Knesset. The term Knesset is derived from the ancient Jewish kingdom, which had the Knesset Hagdolah, or Great Assembly. It was an assembly of 120 of the greatest Torah scholars, including scribes, sages, and prophets, which maintained the spiritual leadership of the Jewish nation. The modern-day Knesset also has 120 members, albeit of lesser stature. Israeli elections are based around proportional representation, and Israelis vote for a party, not a candidate. The more votes a political party receives, the more seats they will get in the Knesset. Even the biggest parties rarely receive more than 20% of votes, ensuring that all governments are a coalition of parties who must work together to form and maintain a functioning government. In the Knesset, all sectors of our society are represented by their elected MP, including left and right, religious and secular, Jews, Arabs, Christians, and Muslims. Contrary to its representation, one of the purest forms of democracy ever put into action was within Israel's kibbutz movement. These small communal villages were formed in the early 20th century of the Yishuv, largely by young Eastern Europeans, and later, though to a lesser degree, by Mizrahi Jews fleeing ethnic cleansing in Arab states. It was they who developed the land and the concept of the kibbutz in response to the socioeconomic challenges of the time. The kibbutzim practice a form of socialism for a just and egalitarian society, one that, unlike the USSR and other socialist or communist countries, implemented a form of pure direct democracy. Everyone joined the kibbutz of their free will, no one was forced to stay, and all members had equal votes. Kibbutz committees made decisions after members had actively participated in the various internal processes, and important decisions were brought before a general vote of the entire community. The kibbutz had a deeply profound impact on the development of the fledgling modern state of Israel. This included providing the country with more than its share of politicians, military officers, artists, and writers. Rather than holding people to narrow confines, the kibbutz gave its members a base to flourish and was for a time, perhaps, a social and political utopia. However, with the advent of financial affluence, debts, and globalization, the kibbutz movement as a socialist enterprise withered away. The vast majority of kibbutzim today are no longer based around the egalitarian ideas of the past, but have implemented a capitalist ideology. Israel does not have a constitution, primarily due to the disagreement whether or not it should have one, and for the simple inability to come to a consensus on what that constitution should say. Israel's enacted 14 basic laws which have been given constitutional status. These laws are meant to guarantee human and civil rights, to define the country as a Jewish and democratic state, and to define the system of government and power of its three branches. Many people view Israel's Proclamation of Independence as a constitutional document, and its basic principles state the following. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The Proclamation of Independence was further strengthened in 1992 with the passing of the Basic Law on Human Dignity and Liberty and the Basic Law of Freedom of Occupation. These laws cite the Proclamation of Independence and strengthen its legal status. Israel's Proclamation of Independence did call for the adoption of a constitution, and indeed the Provisional State Council established a Constitution Committee. It was tasked with preparing a draft constitution. Disagreements, however, arose within the committee. Whilst the majority argued that the Proclamation of Independence established a legal and moral duty to adopt a constitution, others argued that the proclamation did not have any binding legal status and that it was not the right time. The minority opinion prevailed, and no constitution was adopted. Some of the arguments against it said that past constitutions were designed to deal with social and economic issues that are no longer in existence. Some even argued, somewhat absurdly, that since Israel was currently home to only a portion of the world's Jewry, it didn't have the mandate to adopt a full constitution before a majority of Jews were in Israel. There was also concerns that a constitution would divide the population, such as between religious and secular Jews. Before the October 7th invasion, of course, Israel was deeply embroiled in political divisions unlike any we had experienced before, and the embittered sides both pulling hard in the name of democracy. In January 2023, Israel's Minister of Justice announced the legislative overhaul of the judicial system. Supporters of the change argued that our courts had become too powerful and are overriding the decisions of elected politicians, and in effect, the will of the people. Others believed that the changes would weaken Israel's democratic institutions, effectively ending the vital checks and balances on governmental power. The proposed changes included 1. To end the standard of reasonableness doctrine, which allowed courts to oversee cases where the government's decision, quote, disproportionately focuses on political interests without sufficient consideration for public trust and its protection, unquote. And 2. Give the government almost complete control over the selection of judges, which could politicize the ranks of Israel's judicial system. 3. To grant the Knesset the authority to override judicial decisions of the Supreme Court with a supreme majority in the Knesset. And 4. To transform Knesset legal advisors into political appointees, which would diminish their impartiality. Under the current system, ministers are obliged to follow advice from the Knesset legal advisors. The proposed changes led to mass weekly demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. For many, the most damaging aspect was that the proposed judicial overhaul led to arguments and exacerbated deep divisions within Israeli society. The judicial overhaul has since been suspended, and the repeal of standard of reasonableness doctrine that was passed in Knesset in July 2023 was struck down by the Supreme Court on January 1, 2024. Israel suffers, and greatly so, by the same comparable degradations of freedoms and democracy by its leaders as does the rest of the world. It remains, however, a viable state rooted in law and order, with all the brilliance and drive its inhabitants bring. The citizens of this country understand that change can no longer wait, and it is up to us alone, and for our own reasons, that we must act. I would be remiss not to note that the pinnacle structure of a truly Jewish government is not in fact a democracy, though we cling to it in its place, but of rule under an anointed king, but that is a subject for another day and time. It should come as no surprise then that the countries trying to destroy Israel, as are Iran and its allies like Russia, North Korea, and China, are each tyrannical regimes led by autocrats. Radical Islam, and please understand the distinction, is devouring Arab nations whole, destroying their own distinct cultures, and enacting its own version of dark and barbaric totalitarianism. It is no live and let live ideology. It is one that seeks you out to force adherence or to destroy what you love and they hate. Radical Islam is growing at an exponential rate, and its aim is to see the world under its caliphate of Islamic rule. The West has served until today as a refuge for those fleeing this manner of self-destruction. There is nowhere for us to go should it fall. The radical left, for one, assists in its own destruction, having found tribalism as its place of intersection with radical Islam. Both are driven by unbending ideologies and lack of ability to see the individual for the camp of identity they represent. The Islamic Republic of Iran is an Islamic theocracy dominated by Ali Hosseini Khamenei, who has been the supreme ruler in Iran for now 35 years. According to Iran's constitution, the supreme leader is responsible for the delineation and supervision of, quote, the general policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, unquote. He's commander-in-chief and in control of the intelligence and security operations, and he alone can declare war or peace. The supreme leader can appoint and dismiss leaders of the judiciary, the state radio, and television network. According to a survey last year, over 80% of Iranians reject the Islamic Republic and prefer democracy. Iran is ranked at 177 out of 180 in the world for a free press. Iran's repressive regime also includes the ironically named morality police, who have become recently infamous for their severe and regularly lethal enforcement of Islamic law, particularly the enforcement of the hijab. The morality police have been terrorizing Iranian women since their creation in 2005 and are known to intimidate and beat women openly for violations. In just one such well-known case in September 2022, Mahsa Amini was confronted by the police for the crime of wearing her headscarf improperly. She was arrested and beaten so severely she is believed to have died from cerebral hemorrhage. Amini's death sparked mass protests across Iran, but rather than back down, 1 year after Amini's death, and despite widespread criticism, Iran adopted additional draconian legislation that imposed even harsher penalties on women who breach hijab rules, where women now face up to 10 years in jail for violation. Here's an excerpt from an interview by Amir Nader for BBC with Iranian Hamidreza Ahmedabadi, member of the Revolutionary Guard's parliamentary group who help enforce the rules.
We've managed to reach one of the establishment's foot soldiers in Tehran. Hamidreza Ahmedabadi is a member of the Revolutionary Guard's paramilitary group called Basij. It helps enforce rules like the hijab on the streets. He's become a prominent defender of the regime.
One group of these women are mentally challenged and they must be checked in mental health clinics. But others are fooled by the international media like the BBC. They are hallucinating and it won't be difficult for us to deal with them.
Are you not refusing to accept the diversity of Iranian society?
It's a very good question. The majority of our population are Muslim. Once I identified a spy filming a protest. She looked like a terrorist. I went to her and asked her to stop. She confronted me. I slapped her and grabbed her camera and squeezed the lens into her mouth.
It seems like you take pride in being violent towards women.
In our country, there is no such a thing as opponents of Islamic Republic. People are born Muslim, so they need to follow the rules. If anyone wants to breach the laws, the enforcement powers will intervene and arrest them.
North Korea, one of the most repressive regimes in the world, is a one-party state led by a dynastic totalitarian dictatorship under King Jong-un. He became the country's supreme leader in 2011 after the death of his father. The state's characterized by sweeping and arbitrary arrests, detention, and severe punishment for what is deemed as political offense. They hold inside camps political prisoners where torture, forced labor, starvation, and other atrocities regularly take place. Although there are elections, the system denies voters any substantial choice and rules out opposition to its leadership. People's votes are tracked, instilling fear into the masses that they could be accused of treason if they reject the government-backed candidates. North Korea is ranked last in the world for freedom of press. Russia is dominated by Vladimir Putin, who's been in power for 25 years, and in just mid-March 2024 won another presidential election, Mazel Tov, with a whopping 87% of the vote. Votes which are rigged so that Putin's share increase with each election. Putin is the longest-serving Russian or Soviet leader since Joseph Stalin, and rigged voting ensures his power. Hundreds of political dissidents are in jail, protests are forbidden, and his biggest political rival, Alexei Navalny, just died suddenly in an Arctic prison while serving a 19-year sentence on extremism charges. How do dictators like Putin retain power? It's a complex struggle of internal control. Here's a CBS report featuring Andrew Rasilius, an Eastern European defense analyst of CBS News.
To understand Putin, you have to understand what gives him power.
Putin sits on top of a hierarchical structure. He is in control, but he is an autocrat, but he's not an absolute autocrat.
In Putin's world, he is undoubtedly the center. When he speaks, people listen. But his leadership hinges on his ability to control the chaos around him, starting with his inner circle. Senior government officials, whose influence trickles through regional leadership and the parts of the official apparatus that everyday Russians see, hear, and absorb. On the intelligence side, Putin himself is former KGB. Loyalty from main intelligence, domestic intelligence, and foreign intelligence are critical for maintaining control. Perhaps the greatest direct threat to Putin's power, his own military. We've seen his forces rebel since the war in Ukraine started, and many experts believe Putin will continue to rule the country until either he dies or there's a coup.
China is a one-party state that runs all aspects of life inside the massive country of 1.4 billion population. From education to business to social transactions to the government, despite it, the Chinese government is intent on identifying as a democracy, as a throwback to the beginnings of its modern enlightenment, which in 1919 sought to live under a rule based on science and democracy. In 100 years, they have become its polar opposite. It seems like the stuff of Hollywood and fragments of grandparents' stories, but the reach of a destructive authoritarianism is the definition of a living nightmare, one where the individual is not seen but part of the greater whole, a vague and heaving entity that holds everyone and represents precisely none. It's one that restricts or forbids entirely freedoms of speech and autonomy, yes, but so too over your own personal assets. More to the point, and we see it coming home to roost in the West, is the government interference in the decisions and influence over our most precious asset of all, our children. Tibet offers us just one example. China annexed Tibet in 1951, and authorities have since adopted a policy to ensure all Tibetan children learn standard Mandarin. In order to implement this policy, they force parents to send their children, as young as age 4, to boarding school, and if they don't, they face harsh punishment from the authorities. It's estimated that there are 1 million kids in these schools, with over 100,000 between the ages of 4 and 5. America in the West has been the world's defender, or policeman according to your view, of democracy, or at least its alleged moral compass. The U.S. now makes historical breaks with Israel, in both adopting the rhetoric of the genocidal, murderous death and rape cult that is Hamas, and their talking points and stats, as well as in their abstention in the recent UN ceasefire vote. Is it all for the presidential election? Will the process of Israel's isolation continue to snowball? To what end? Will all that was built crumble prematurely as old bridges to morality are burnt? I recall growing up and hearing the oft-repeated phrase, "We don't negotiate with terrorists," and grew to believe it in my bones. Biden from the 90s understood what Biden of 2024 can't sustain. The appeasement of bullies has directly brought this upon us. The erosion of time and perhaps poor decisions have flipped the perspective on its head.
Why is there any incentive for the Arabs to make any compromise in the peace talks? Why, if they know that they must only wait for the United States will do their bargaining for them, why would they compromise? Why would they be reasonable? The absurd notion that publicly vilifying Israel will somehow change its policy. Who in the hell do we think we're dealing with? What makes us think, even if the administration is 100% correct on the policy, what makes them think that in the midst of an election campaign, in the midst of a so-called peace talk, that we can publicly vilify a nation?
The Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza have been infantilized for decades. Doing so has enabled their continued efforts to destroy and delegitimize the Jews and their viable state. It's no less destroyed any opportunity of progress for themselves, and as it is increasingly adopted by the West, who imagines that everyone wants the same things, ushers in its own downfall. The faithful live by books of everlasting relevance, created of a divinity that maintains its applicability throughout the centuries, throughout the millennium. The U.S. Constitution is a work by man. However, it serves as an exquisite representation of the divine wisdom inside us and the highest aims of civilization. It's a clear set of goals for a cohesive nation to work towards and has served as an example to the world for over 200 years. Written in 1787 and in operation since 1789, is said to be the world's longest surviving written charter of government. Its opening words are, "We the people," and lays out from the start that the government exists to serve its citizens. The Constitution carefully lays out the system of government, its checks and balances, to safeguard majority rule and minority rights. The first 10 amendments constitute the Bill of Rights, which includes the right to express ideas through speech and the press, the right to protest, the right to religious beliefs and practices, the right to bear arms, and the right to a jury trial. Over 200 years later, These ideals and rights are deeply rooted in culture and society. These tenets remained of sound body. It's we who would do well to return to the path they cleared long ago. Our throwaway culture imagines there's always something better on the pipeline. We buy the next upgrade, we block those with whom we disagree, and we toss our single-serving receptacle to the bin many times a day. If we abandon the constructs of democracy now, in this era of micromanaged minds and a device in each of our 8 billion hands, there is no better model in production. Not all that has been must be discarded. Without a past, we have no foundations to build a future. There are binary truths. There is right and wrong. Not everything is relative. And choices must be made to progress. Agreed upon boundaries of society are essential to establish a base from which to grow. It is our privilege to be part of these constructs, and their maintenance has always been our task. It's been the shock of a lifetime to watch how quickly it can all unravel. Not everything is a psyop, and there's sound body and mind in the traditions of the past. They've been marker and guide for reasons that still exist. We can use that path of change for refinement, not destruction. There's beauty in symmetry, and I believe it is this which compels us towards democracy. It brought us the cohesiveness of a healthy national pride, a belonging to something that brought you and everyone else together in progress. You could live well and in ways no one had before. You could agree to disagree and still share the same space, and even a beer or two. We need not make any more of it or any less, for its impact has spoken for itself. We'll see you next Wednesday at 6 o'clock Jerusalem time on The Common Denominator.